We will be welcoming the CEO of Ecommerce Forum of South Africa, Dr. Tempest. I need to emphasize that Dr. Tempest will also be joined by Lucien Pierce, and also will be, of course, moderated by Mustapha Zaouini. All right, so the next, oh yes, we have Mr. Tempest there. All right, Lucien, Mustapha. All right, gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Tserofatso. Thank you for the previous discussion, Dylan. That was quite interesting and linking straight away into trust, as you mentioned. So my name is Mustapha Zaouini. I'm co-founder of a purpose-driven startup studio in fintech and edutech. Half of my career was actually in telecoms and the rest in fintech. I'm based right now, I'm calling you from Dubai. I'm very proud and pleased to be working with Connected Africa and the rest of the team here on the panel on this topic around how can telcos leverage consumer trust and emerging technologies to develop hyper growth in digital services. We have a wonderful panel this afternoon with Lucien Pierce and Alastair Tempest to talk about challenges, opportunities to get there. May I ask maybe the panelists to introduce yourself, where you're dialing from, and why you're here today. Maybe Lucien, you can start.
Mustapha, I'm not sure why you asked me to go first, because Alastair certainly is a legend, as I saw in one of the comments. But yes, thank you for letting me go first. I suppose you're saving the best for last. Thank you. It's a great opportunity to be here to talk about something that's exciting and very close to my heart. As you might have seen from some of the marketing material relating to what we're talking about today, I'm a telecoms lawyer. I've been involved in the field for about 25 years. Not as close to Alastair in terms of experience, but yes, something very close to my heart and that I'm excited to be talking about today. So I look forward to the discussion. Great.
Thank you. Alastair?
Thank you very much indeed, Mustapha, and good afternoon, good morning, depending where you're calling from, to all the people listening. My name is Alastair Tempest. I'm the CEO of the Ecommerce Forum Africa, which is a Pan-African body, and the CEO of the Ecommerce Forum of South Africa. So the two bodies in one, as it were. You get two for the price of one in me. I'm delighted to follow my very good friend and colleague, Dylan Piatti. Dylan was our chair 2 years ago now. And what he talked about in terms of trust is exactly what we're going to address as well. So I very much look forward to this. I'm a specialist in e-commerce and also the consumer legislation around that. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
So I will start with an intro on the context of why we're talking about this topic, specifically from a telco perspective. Then we'll split the discussion into two parts. First on the consumer trust and consumer relevance, and the second part on data and telcos as data protectors. Then we'll have some time for Q&A. So in total, we have another between 45 minutes. So we have ample time to talk about things. If you have some questions, please drop them on the chat, and we'll pick them up at the end of the second part. So let me start a little bit about why we're here today and why we're talking about telcos in general and trust. And I'm sure you had a lot of the sessions today. As you may know, mobile phones outnumbers already people by 9 to 7.7 billion, right? We're talking about intelligent connectivity. So that's a mix of high-speed network, flexibility, Internet of everything, and AI. And we say that basically we estimate that by 2025, we will be using each and every one of us around 5,000 digital interactions per day, knowingly or not. That's quite a large number. And clearly, for those who are in our age groups, this next decade will be very different from what we've seen in the last decades of the industry. And to do that, a lot of transformation around consumer lives, enterprise, and the broader economy. We're estimating also that the digital transformation in the telecoms sector represents an opportunity of $2 trillion. So that means a lot of new revenue streams, much beyond connectivity. That include, as we talked, integrate IoT or integrated Internet of Things, solution, consumer, enterprise digital services, but also new ways of communicating, leveraging natural human interface. We talked about Sophia earlier, augmented reality, virtual reality, even the metaverse. Ultimately, all of them are needed or are needing a network infrastructure and a telco somewhere. But at the same time, we can argue that the value of the telco is getting lower and lower. I mean by that for a long time, we're going to talk about regulation, but telco once relied on regulation, on capital intensity, customer growth to generate this healthy and growing return, but the world has changed. We see that they've been struggling actually in getting the leadership in the digital economy when you talk about software, app, solution, content. Also, I will say that in-house innovation, from my experience, has been often missing the target from their perspective. M&As have been looking at adjacent sectors, but again, sometimes wrong targets, wrong time. And now, adding to the mix, right, we have competition coming with less regulated, more innovative technology players that are making things much more complicated for the telcos. And so these technology players are taking probably, and sometimes, a much bigger share of the value created. So that means maybe the operators are losing the relevance in customer minds, if not before, definitely more and more. So what does the future look like for telecom operator from our perspective? Either, they will play to win the whole value chain, right? So from the infrastructure, but most importantly, to mastering the customer relationship and have full access of B2B and B2C customers. Or on the worst case scenario, they will just become a wholesaler of network to B2B clients and of course, everything else in between. So coming closer to the consumer trust, there's two trends that are important, I think, for our discussion. One is consumer behavior. We've seen the pandemic have changed a lot how we live, how we work, how we interact with brands, how dependence on online services, the need for data, in the pyramid of Maslow is probably power and data are probably the most important, right? And on the other side, we've seen a massive increase of of the exponential growth of the unicorn economy, as we call it, in this Web3 era. And that touches everything, right, in terms of industry. And so the telcos, there's an opportunity here for generating new revenues. We've seen telcos providing new marketplaces, platform-based ecosystems for these new services that touch in immersive gaming, entertainment, critical industry services, health applications. Consumer electronics, also very important because it touches how day-to-day life, right? Smart homes, cars, wearables. And these trends are reshaping really these business models. So when we talk about consumer trust, it is clearly a valuable asset for building the loyalty and driving growth in these digital marketplaces and digital services. Telcos can capitalize on this trust to unlock new monetization avenues and transition from just being a provider to be much more closer involved in the digital services like they were once, I guess, at the beginning of that era. So maybe I'd start with Alastair. I mean, how do you view, how can they win this trust, this consumer trust race from your perspective? And it's a big question, so it's quite open. And so please feel free to color it the way you want.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, as Dylan pointed out, and as you have pointed out just now, trust is not a given, is never a given. We don't trust people and we don't trust businesses automatically. We don't walk down the street and say, oh, I trust that person or whatever. Trust must be earned and it must be retained. Again, it's not something that just earned and then you live on it for the rest of your life. So the e-commerce forum of South Africa was actually created in 2016 to address, specifically to address the trust deficit, which e-commerce suffered in those days. Consumers didn't trust, at least in South Africa, they didn't trust putting their credit card details online, and they didn't trust that the goods that they bought would actually appear at their doorstep. And the same is true for business. Many businesses didn't want to enter into the digital commerce space. They just didn't trust it. And this was, I think, particularly true in business to business. I did a study for the International Trade Center back in 2019 on business to business e-commerce. And what I discovered was that, yeah, there were a lot of e-commerce sites, business to business, but they were just a catalog, a paper catalog, which had been put online. And then at the bottom of it said, ring us for any information. So there was no interaction whatsoever. That isn't e-commerce. However, having said that, the COVID era and pandemic has completely been a game changer, as everyone knows. Businesses were forced to move online, and consumers found that they could actually trust e-commerce. What we now find, Mustapha, as you know, is that we are in the post-COVID world. And the big question is, will consumers continue to look at e-commerce? Will e-commerce continue to prosper? Will it continue to grow? Or will consumers simply go back to their old habits of buying in brick and mortars? And I think, I'm not the only one, because Dylan also made that point very clear earlier on. The answer will depend to some degree at least, if not to a very large degree, on whether e-commerce can retain consumers' trust. And there's the problem. There's the rub. Because over the last 3 years, with the increase of broadband internet connection, cybercrime has grown dramatically, as you all know, in Africa. And that includes fraud on e-commerce. We have here in South Africa a sort of quasi-legal body called the Consumer Goods and Services Ombuds. And they've recorded over 300% increase in consumer complaints on e-commerce since 2020. Previously, most complaints, by the way, that the Ombudsman received were concerned telecoms services, telecommunications services. So e-commerce has now replaced telecoms as the sector with the most complaints, I'm sorry to say. And obviously we need to do something to counter that problem before it erodes overall trust in e-commerce. We'll also later, I think, come on to the whole issue of the African Free Trade Area and the greater opportunities to sell cross-frontier that brings. So business needs to be aware of that as well. It's not just business to business. As I said, it's also business to consumer as well. We believe that it's essential to build trust for business to consumer and business to business across the continent. And the ways to do this. Dylan mentioned earlier that we did try, under his presidency of the E-commerce Forum South Africa, to introduce a trust mark, but we just weren't able to do it. It wasn't the time. Now is the time. Now we've moved forward. And as I said at the beginning, trust isn't a given. It must be earned and it must be retained. So, ladies and gentlemen, to start with, I'd like to lay a challenge before you. I'd like to point out, firstly, obviously, that e-commerce depends on robust telecoms services to sell products at a distance. Without you, we wouldn't exist. And without us, you wouldn't make so much profit. So there we are. It's a very nice business relationship. But I believe, we believe, that we should work together to promote trust for both businesses and for the consumers. And we need to cooperate on that. So this is my challenge to you. Will you work with us to encourage greater trust? So I'll leave that and leave it over to Lucien to bring on the goods.
I think, Lucien, you're on mute, but yes.
Great. Thank you, Alastair, and thank you, Mustapha. Alastair, you've covered a lot of the e-commerce side, but where I come in, when it comes to trust, I think back to about 6 years ago when we had a famous DJ who started this protest, and it started in social media. And he had the hashtag data must fall. And it all stemmed from this, whether it was proven or not, but this belief that the data that students and indigent people and anyone else who relied so much on the data that they bought, this data just kept disappearing. And the cost of that data was also exorbitant. And with that taking off, you would have seen at the time an immense groundswell against telcos, simply because of the cost and the fact that they weren't explaining clearly why data was disappearing. And it turned out that there was a pretty legitimate reason for the data disappearing. I'll get back to the cost aspects later. And it was simply a failure on the part of the telcos and those providing phones to explain that there were certain settings on many of the mobiles that would automatically update and literally use data as soon as it was reloaded. And having taken care of that, that data must fall movement actually fizzled, because there was an explanation for this, and people started realizing that it wasn't really the telcos who were stealing their data, it was the phones that just needed their settings changed. So an example like that, for me, is how telcos, if they're proactive in the way that they deal with their customers, can build trust. Then there was the second element, which related to the cost. And in this instance, I think the telcos themselves probably didn't play open cards as much as they should have. And I think it was a missed opportunity again. In this instance, our data costs were shown to be much more than some of our peers across Africa. And this came out of an inquiry that was done by our Competition Commission. And they demonstrated that there wasn't really a need to have data costs at that level, because the infrastructure and the various operational reasons, and I'm now straying into territory that I'm not pretty good at, as that's probably for the economists, but basically the costs weren't justified. And what then happened was obligations were placed on the telcos over the course of the next 2 years. So this report was released late 2019, early 2020, and an obligation was placed on the telcos to reduce their data costs over this 2-year period. And I'm talking about South African telcos. And the costs came down. And I thought about it. I thought, wow, what a missed opportunity to take consumers into your confidence and lower costs unilaterally without having this big stick waved at you, forcing you to lower your costs. So for me, those were 2 examples of where telcos missed the opportunity to build trust with their customers and with consumers. Now that's sort of the negative aspect, if I could call it that. And I'll now move on to the positive aspect of how the telcos themselves demonstrated that they could come to the aid of consumers. I think this might be the case across the rest of the world as well, but when the pandemic hit, we all know, and we've heard this hundreds of times, how everybody was suddenly compelled to work from home. And that was great, you know, for those of us who had fiber lines or those of us who had fixed broadband. The telcos came to the party by doing something that I certainly didn't expect. And I can tell you, when my service provider did this, you know, it certainly endeared me to renewing the term that I was subscribed for with them. And what happened was many of the ISPs and the telcos themselves allowed a doubling of the speeds at which you were connecting via your broadband. And that in itself, you know, certainly endeared me to my service provider and built a lot more trust. So those are examples for me of how you can lose trust and how you can gain trust. Another angle that I think telcos are missing out on, although some of them have certainly seen this opportunity. If you look behind me, you'll see what looks like a very strange sort of hieroglyphics. But that is actually, you know, the images are of the many houses. So any of you who have visited Johannesburg in South Africa and who've traveled from our main airport in Johannesburg to the city would certainly have passed by an informal settlement called Alexandra. And if you've passed by Alexandra, you'll see many of the houses which are built haphazardly in many cases. Some might not have piped water, others might have outdoor bathrooms and toilets. But the one thing you will see on each of these informal houses is a satellite dish. So for me, I see an opportunity for telcos to build and build this trusting relationship with some of the lower LSE, if we still use that term, subscribers, whether it be informal settlements or whether it be in outlying rural areas. South Africa has 93 or 94% coverage as far as 4G is concerned. And I see an opportunity for telcos to build a relationship very early on with subscribers in rural and outlying areas. I saw a report from the National, the Broadband Commission, which is a United Nations body. They released a report about 2 weeks ago. And, you know, there was a measurement which said that almost every subscriber in South Africa, and I use this example because that's what I focus on, is within 10 kilometers of a broadband, a fixed broadband connection. And initially that sounded impressive. And I thought to myself, well, actually, why does it have to be 10 kilometers? Why can't it be 5 kilometers or 3 kilometers or 2 kilometers? And in my mind, that's another opportunity that telcos could seize to build trust with consumers. The other aspect that just struck me, and this was in the news the other day, earlier this week, was the breach that Optus, I think it is, experienced. And if you look at that, the negative publicity that it's experiencing is certainly going to do a lot of damage to its reputation. So for me, that lesson is something that telecoms providers could take to make sure that they don't take the security requirements of subscribers for granted. You know, we've all seen examples, and I think it was one of the subscribers in the UK that lost a huge proportion of its subscribers just because of one cyber breach. So if you can maintain that level of trust, then I certainly think that you'll either maintain or even grow your subscriber base. So that's my input on just that opening subject, Mustapha.
Thank you, Lucien. I mean, two main principles I got from your points here, and that will before we go back to Alastair on dwelling more how we can get there. But one is, of course, putting the customer in control. You talked about data transparency, basically. How do I control my data? You know, what am I paying for? and maybe even, you know, if there's some kind, and I've seen some markets where some operators have been facilitating even working from home for free almost, as long as I'm participating in the society, right? Some kind of easier packages, let's say, for that. So I think that part is putting the customer in control. And the second point you mentioned here is actually security, right? You know, how do I actually, and we'll talk a little bit more in the second part of the regulation around that, but still, as you know, I'm trusting my operator. Maybe I'm trusting my bank more than my telco operator today. Yet, as often we say, you know, my phone is really the key to everything, even my bank, right? So I think the security is a second point. Alastair, maybe we can talk a little bit, I mean, putting that into context with the different business models, and we talked about different ecosystems, right? So now we you know, even if I am, you know, the telco, I'm providing a different type of digital services, as we mentioned earlier. How do you envisage that verification of the trust? How can you create that relationship between multiple parties, and how does tech play also in that too, in order to make it like, you know, the balance between trust and convenience? So how do I facilitate that? I mean, how would you work from, you know, you talked about Trustmark in the past, so how can you do that?
Thank you very much indeed. As some of you may have picked up, I come from Europe, and I spent most of my career in Europe. In Europe, all the e-commerce associations have what they call trust marks. It's also true in America as well, as Trustee is probably the oldest trust mark. And that deals, by the way, with data privacy issues. So the whole idea of this was to provide consumers with a trusted, with the ability to trust, because behind every trust mark is a guarantee that the company that you're dealing with is bona fide, that it has the right rules and regulations. In the case of, for example, South Africa or Nigeria or Kenya, that it has applied in its privacy policies the right rules for those countries. What we tried to do, what Dylan referred to earlier in his presentation, what we tried to do is to get a lawyer to look at people's websites and then give them a tick, a trust mark, if you like it, a certification. That didn't work. It didn't work because it's quite costly to pay for a lawyer to look at these sorts of things. Lawyers are much better employed checking afterwards rather than doing the automatic work that's needed. So we were a bit stuck because in those days there wasn't any sort of automation system that we could use. Now along comes blockchain, and that allows verification. So what we're proposing is some form of blockchain system, which would then verify or certify that a company, whether it's a business-to-consumer company or a business-to-business company, is actually what it says it is, that it applies the law, that it applies the rules and regulations that are necessary. And if you can do that, and then also have behind it an organization to whom people can write to and complain, etc., that I think is the solution. Well, that is the solution that we are proposing. Once the software is in place, the actual verification then costs virtually nothing. It's very, very cheap, but it needs the software. So we're working, for example, with Mustapha exactly on that project. What it needs is that the lawyers, Lucien and others check to make sure that everything is in place within the checking process. And then if something goes wrong, then they're there to help the consumer or the business that's fallen foul of something or another. So this is how we're thinking of it. Thank you.
So I mentioned earlier Web3, and in fact we move in a lot from centralized to decentralized, in all kind of innovation and technologies and services. So in your case, in order to address some of these ecosystems where, for example, and I mentioned, for example, the partnership between the telco and let's call it a unicorn from digital services, right? We have a lot of different type of interactions, and therefore, blockchain used in traceability, but also how do I pass that trust ultimately through the different parties? And coming back to Lucien, right, there'll be, clearly one of the aspects here, and it's a challenge also. So one is identity, right, that you're talking about, Alastair, right? Identity of the business that you're working with, some kind of decentralized identity mechanism. To put back to my first principle of putting the control in the customer's hand, right? That's one aspect. On the other aspect, we do need the lawyers, because actually there's a lot of regulation around, data sharing, right? And how actually now we have an ecosystem with a lot of different players, right? I saw recently a supermarket launched in China where actually I can just walk in, right? There's a lot of this regulation. I can walk in and identify exactly my needs, my behavior, in which product I should be directed to buy based on all kind of demographics that are knowingly sharing or not, right? Even in that process, which is offline and online, right? I'm sharing a lot of the data associated with that. And so in this case, I have also a question, right? Whether I'm on a B2B or on a B2C, I want to verify the identity, but also I want maybe control my data. This time, not my data package from a telco perspective, but actually my asset, right? And so we've seen a lot of challenges around that. And maybe, Lucien, how do you, this whole aspect of digital identity and the data, and the fact that I mentioned earlier, banks maybe are a little bit more, we trust more the bank than the telco. Maybe we should not, or maybe we should. But the point is that for the telco to gain that, to win that race, right, they still need to do a lot more in that aspect. So how do you visualize this in a world where decentralized, I can create a mechanism to verify the partners that I'm working with, but yet regulation need to go to the point. And then we come back after that on the opportunity around Africa trade agreement to accelerate that.
Great, Mustapha. I like the example you're giving of a bank or a telco. The reality is that if you look at what's going on where we are on the southern tip of Africa, banks are becoming telcos and telcos are becoming banks. And very soon, the two are going to be, one and the same. And for me, that is quite an important consideration. And I should perhaps start with an example of a dispute I advised a client on. In this instance, the client was defrauded of a certain amount of money, quite a large amount of money. And the difficulty we had was that the fraudsters had somehow obtained quite a few of his critical credentials and had managed to bypass the security mechanisms that the bank had put in place, which in this particular instance was the good old-fashioned OTP. And the transaction went through without the client ever having been a party to handing over that OTP. The matter was eventually settled, the dispute was settled. And the difficulty, or for me, the disappointing part was we were heading in the direction of being able to determine where the leak or the fault or the breach had occurred. And the question was, in transmitting the OTP from the bank system onto the network and eventually to where it was supposed to go, being the client, somehow that one-time password had been diverted. That SMS had been diverted to the fraudsters. And that for me is a primary example, or the main consideration in how telcos often are the intermediary between the people engaging in e-commerce, whether it be the bank or the retailer and the customer. And if we are to ensure that e-commerce is to grow and telcos are to somehow get more business out of this, we've got to ensure that the entire process from the purchaser to the telco, to the retailer or the bank is absolutely secure. And we've got to find a mechanism that somehow is beyond reproach. And for me, again, I'm not an expert in cybersecurity and trust and verification. I know the basics from a legal perspective. But if we can establish a mechanism that is virtually foolproof, and what comes to mind to me immediately is distributed ledger technology, blockchain, all of those, I think there will be a lot more trust between consumers, retailers, telcos, and we'll see huge growth in that sector. And again, I come back to my pet, I won't call it issue, but consideration. And as e-commerce grows, and as we start servicing more of the people in the informal areas and rural areas, we've actually got to have something in place that is almost foolproof. And it might, some people might argue that I'm sort of straying into discriminating and saying that people in rural areas, are not technologically savvy. But the reality is that there are people who might not easily or very quickly pick up the sort of ways of transacting online initially. And they're the ones that technology such as blockchain, which doesn't really require much intervention and doesn't require an OTP to be put into a phone or to be given to some fraudster when they call you. We need that sort of technology. So yes, one, we need a mechanism that is going to allow transactions to happen securely, because coming back to the point that I made in the beginning, somebody, the fraudsters in the case of the example I gave, would have, one, been able to obtain my client's mobile phone number. Two, they would have obtained some sort of way to divert that password and OTP to their system. So we've got to find ways to, one, ensure that there is really secure security as far as data is concerned. We've got to make sure that biometrics, personal information like biometrics are absolutely secure, whether they're housed in the bank, on the telco system, or somewhere else. So cybersecurity and making sure that we have common laws from a cybersecurity perspective that will allow us to not only obtain protection, but prosecute those who engage in cybercrime. Those need to be bolstered, and we need to make sure that they're in place. And secondly, we need to make sure that privacy laws are strengthened amongst the various parties that are involved in these sorts of transactions. Lastly, of course, we touched on it in the beginning, but consumer protection laws, so that no matter where you are, you're sure to get some sort of recourse, even in situations where, like the example I gave, because at the outset, my client didn't know where to go. And if it's made clear to indigent people, who might not be so au fait with transacting online, that it is quite easy or straightforward to get some sort of redress, then I think we're heading down the right path.
Thank you. I mean, I think, yes, I mean, I see one point also that challenge for me is you mentioned the word at the beginning, intermediary, and often the platform are intermediary, but actually, like you said, me as a consumer, right, my data is flowing through multiple parties, right? So who do I go to, right, for things? So either the regulator is enabling, but still, you may have players that are sitting outside of the region that you're operating in. So that then, still from a tech perspective, is a telco, because we are here talking about my point of entrance as my mobile phone and my telco provider, shouldn't they be actually more than just an intermediary? Shouldn't she actually be guaranteeing actually that my data, because they have so much information already about me, even from a KYC perspective, shouldn't they be participating in, if they're opening marketplaces, validating, that the suppliers are, respecting certain ethics and certain regulations, as Alastair mentioned, and shouldn't they be also validating that, giving me the traceability of where my data has been shared with and how can I actually, consent and maybe even, like you said, help me in the dispute, right? To say exactly who's been leaking that sort of information. And I think it may be for me also where the future of the telco need to define themselves. Are they just a platform, or actually are they, in order to gain back to that consumer trust, right? We just have a few more minutes, and I wanted to move towards, before giving back the hand to you, Lucien, maybe for closing or opening questions. I think we have some. But Alastair, so we talked here about, specifically the challenge of more than one region, right? And we know the Africa Trade Agreement is going to be potentially a massive player here to accelerate actually the trade and e-commerce. Can you give us a little bit more a view on, as you're an expert on this, where we are on that specifically in terms of e-commerce and standards for digital services, and what's your views on this?
Thank you very much indeed. We've actually just reached a critical point with the African Free Trade Area. The African Free Trade Area with the Secretariat in Ghana has been negotiating tariffs and trying to remove tariffs between the member states. So there are actually, I think, 48 countries which have signed up for the African Free Trade Area, and the tariffs are being removed slowly but surely. There are even some experiments going on now between, I think it's 7 different countries, to see whether this operation works properly and how it works. They've also got a payment system in place, which is starting in 7 countries in West Africa. But in August, they started negotiating what they call a protocol on digital trade, and digital trade includes e-commerce. So that protocol will be key to how e-commerce can operate throughout the continent. And it's up to the Secretariat now to start negotiating and drafting this protocol. And the protocol will certainly include all the issues which Lucien mentioned, the privacy issues, the consumer protection issues, the flow of data issues, IP, intellectual property. All these different things need to be put into that protocol in some way or another. They will also probably be dealt with separately in conventions of the African Union. But at the moment, what we're looking at is this protocol and then how that operates and how that will be negotiated. So we are very much involved in that. And we hope that the Secretariat will listen to what's needed rather than just doing a quick and easy protocol, off the top of a piece of, off the end of an envelope, as they used to call it. It needs to be much more concentrated and cover a very large area. I think Lucien also made a couple of comments which I'd like to quickly comment on. We in South Africa don't have mobile money to the extent that they do in other countries. M-Pesa in Kenya, for example, is said to cover or to carry 2/3 of the Kenyan GDP. So it's a completely different picture than we have here. Mobile money, Africa is the leader of mobile money. the country, surprisingly enough, with more mobile money accounts than anywhere else per head of population is Somalia, of all places. So we should be very proud of what we've done, and we need to build on that. We need, obviously, to have the rules and regulations in order to have a level playing field. You can't do business without a level playing field. And this is exactly, I think, Lucien's point, that if there is privacy law, strict privacy law in Kenya, in Nigeria, and here in South Africa, also in Mauritius, a couple of other countries, and no privacy law in other countries, there's going to be a real problem. Whose law applies, what happens, and people who are businessmen who are not very honest will go to the lowest common denominator to rule. So these are issues that need to be looked at, which are being looked at. And again, I put my name, my email address in the comments. So anyone who wants to contact me, please do. Thanks.
Lots to cover, lots to talk. I mean, 4 points before I pass on to maybe check some questions quickly. We started with customer in control, right? Then we talked about prioritization of security, right? I mean, making sure we talked cyber security and the regulation around that. We didn't have enough time to talk so much, although it was inherent to the discussion around hyper personalization, you know, the customers, the user-centric, the journey itself, right? The personalized service and how they're using that. And my last point will say that maybe telcos should go one step even further when we talk about the data, is actually giving back some money for the use of our data, right? So creating a model where actually we participate in, and again, coming back to tech, maybe blockchain is one part of that model. We see that in the gaming industry, right? Play to earn to play, right? Maybe, you know, we're giving them a lot of assets. Maybe the consumer should also have some part of that return on that asset one way or another. Maybe the Serofazzo, you had some questions maybe from the audience, or should we try to round up?
Well, absolutely. I always have questions, good questions. One for each of our speakers, Mr. Tempest. You did mention that, you know, consumers did not trust that, you know, the product will be delivered. How did you bridge that trust deficit to say that not only will your product be delivered, but exactly what you've ordered will be exactly what you receive? How did you, you know, bridge that in the e-commerce space?
Thank you very much indeed. I think the issue is that we haven't breached it, or bridged it rather. We still have the problem. What we are lucky, at least in South Africa, is that we have this quasi-legal body, which is called the Consumer Goods and Services Ombuds, and they take complaints and they can carry them forward on a legal basis. So they can approach and fine companies which don't do what they should do. So that's an important issue within it. But I think also it was the COVID which was a game changer. That actually made people suddenly think, oh well, I can call in for a meal on wheels. I can order my groceries online and they will arrive in my house. If I buy a shirt and it's the wrong color, if I bought this shirt and it turned out to be green instead of blue, I can send it back. And I think all those sorts of things do build up trust. But there is that extra bit that we are talking about here, this need to try to ensure that business to consumer and business to business are verified and certified so that the consumers have a greater trust. Thanks for the question.
from a consumer protectionist, I think Lucien here, the lawyer, will tell us more. From a Consumer Protection Act, right? With digital now being the future, where I don't take my product back to the store, but now I have to ship it back. What are some of the laws? What does that look like from a legal perspective? Are we seeing any new laws as far in the e-commerce space that are coming to protect the consumer, or are we just retrofitting current retail laws that are existing to the digital world?
That's an important question, Tsegofatso. As we move into the digital world, where, as Alastair said, you can order whatever it is that you need online and needn't ever deal with a human being apart from whoever might be dropping off your parcel at your house. The reality is, even where you have consumer laws in place, if you have a problem, you need to be sure about who it is that you direct your problem at. So again, it comes back to what we've been talking about, being able to verify with certainty who is on the other side and know that indeed whoever it is that you're dealing with exists and has a place where you can get them, approach them if you have a complaint. Or if you go to a consumer protection body, you know that that consumer protection body will know where to find the other party, the retailer or whoever it is that you have a gripe with. As far as the laws are concerned, I think they're relatively technology neutral in that, no matter what your complaint is, they will be able to address it. So I don't see, in South Africa, I don't see any need for us really to change our laws, because they cover many different scenarios. What I do think we need is, and it comes back to the African continental free trade area, that if we're going to promote this region and have e-commerce happening with ease and with certainty and with trust, one, we're going to need to have consistent or consumer protection laws that have at least or take care of the basics to satisfy any complaints or issues and to provide consumers with the basic levels of protection that they will need. So we're going to need a very consistent approach to consumer protection across South Africa. If I order something from Djibouti or Ghana or Morocco, I want to be able to know that as much as I'm sitting, a few thousand kilometers away, there is a mechanism, an agency, a body in Djibouti, Morocco, or Ghana that is going to assure me or give me the comfort that I can take care or have my issue resolved. So for me, consumer protection laws, the ones that we have currently in South Africa, provide a reasonable level of protection. What I would like to see, if Africa, for example, is going to engage in this expected e-commerce, we're going to need to make sure that, one, we can trust who we're doing business with, and secondly, that we have recourse when things go wrong. So yes, I hope I've addressed your questions, Fatso.
Yes, absolutely. Just one more before Mr. Mohammed will take over. Back to you, Mr. Tempest. We've seen it in the banking industry. There's less consumers going to the branch because we don't need to go to the branch for any banking services. Is that also the trend in the retail, at least in the clothing or in the food retail? Are there similar trends? Would you advise large retailers, let's say the clothing retailers, to be closing down their branches and driving traffic online, or is the South African consumer still prefers to queue and buy goods?
I think South African consumers always love to go to shopping malls or shopping centres. That's one of the the sports, together with cricket and rugby and football. There are 4 sports in South Africa, and one of them's going and to be seen in shopping malls. So I don't think shopping malls are going to disappear. I think what will happen, though, is that, and has happened, it is happening already, is that there's a greater buildup of consumers who are much better aware and much better educated in where to get a good deal. So whereas they might go shopping with their eyes in a shopping center, they will have already looked online to see where they can get the best price. And that might be in the shop, and then they'll go into that shop and buy it, or it might be online. And I think that is what's happening. That is definitely, I mentioned that I'm European. I lived in Brussels for over 30 years, and that was already happening before I came here in 2011 in Brussels. And so what one sees in Europe, for example, is that around about 25%, maybe even 30%, I think it is in the UK, of retail trade is online. But that doesn't stop people also buying in the high street. And I think that will continue. It doesn't, there is an issue in America where a lot of shopping malls closed down, but they did close down for different reasons, completely different, nothing to do with what happens here or anywhere else. And it was a lot to do with the fact that people were simply not going to cinemas any longer. And shopping malls in America, many of them were based around the cinema. So when the cinema died, the flow of traffic died as well. But that's just one of those things. So thank you for that question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tempest. Indeed, one of the most insightful, detailed panel discussion. I, for one, got to learn a lot. I'd like to thank you for taking time off your busy schedules to join us. Thank you, Lucien. Thank you so much, Mustapha. It was indeed a pleasure having you. In the essence of time, we may have to cut short. I think we've already exceeded 20 minutes of the assigned time. However, should we have any questions, right? What we will do is we will individually redirect them to whoever the questions are addressed to, and accordingly, hope that you would find a convenient time to respond to the same. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much, then. Thank you, Mr. Pierce. Thank you, Zaouini. Thank you, Mr. Tempest.
Thank you, Mohammed.
See you soon.
Thank you, Lucien. Thank you, Alastair.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was quite an